Welcome back, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to those of you who are just joining us to day one of escaide 2021, which is being held entirely online for the second year running due to the pandemic. I'm Karen Coleman. I'm a journalist and broadcaster from Ireland, and I'm facilitating this event. So now it's time for our first plenary session of the conference. And the theme of this session is communicating science and scientific uncertainty during an evolving pandemic. This session will focus on the difficulties many scientists face communicating scientific data and uncertainty during a pandemic to different audiences, including policymakers, colleagues, journalists, and the general public. It's going to be chaired by two escaide Scientific Committee members. They are Mike Catchpole from the ECDC, whom we just heard from a little earlier, and Susan Hahné from the National Institute for Public Health and the Environment, or RIVM, in the Netherlands. And just a reminder again that Mike Catchpole is the Chief Scientist at the ECDC and Chair of the escaide Scientific Committee, and Susan Hahné heads the Department for Early Warning and Surveillance at the Centre for Epidemiology and Surveillance of Infectious Diseases at the RIVM in the Netherlands. And in addition, she is host site supervisor for Piot Fellows at RIVM, and she's recently co-authored a book on the evaluation of the vaccination programs. So our two chairs will now introduce their keynote speakers and panelists and moderate the session, and I'll see you again a little bit later. So Mike and Susan, I'll hand over to you now.
Yeah, thank you, Karen, for this introduction. So good morning or good afternoon or good evening or even good night to all of you. And thank you very much for joining in this extremely busy time. And I'm delighted I can moderate the session together with Mike Catchpole. Now, this session is about communicating science and much more difficulty in communicating scientific uncertainty during an evolving pandemic. Now, when we were preparing the session, we thought about it as a matrix. So on the x-axis, there's the audiences to communicate with. So that's colleagues, scientific bodies, policymakers, and then the media and general public. And there are difficulties and opportunities, of course, with all of these. From my own experience in the COVID crisis, even talking about science with colleagues in the same institute can be very challenging, especially when the evidence is changing over time, let alone talking with politicians or the public. Now, on the y-axis, there are the different levels of evidence, and this is, of course, dynamic, so it changes over time. Now, in this session, we have four excellent speakers to reflect on all of this and hopefully give us some ideas about how to best communicate. The first is our keynote speaker, that is Professor Peter Piot. He's a professor of global health and was until recently director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And I think he has much experience of communicating science to power. So he's currently special advisor to COVID-19 to the president of the European Commission. And he's quite famous for being the founding director of UNAIDS and Under Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, then we have three excellent panel members. The first is Marta Hugas. She's the chief scientist of the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA. And I think until COVID-19, food safety was one of the areas where most political crisis occurred. It's highly political food safety, and communicating about science and uncertainty is really challenging in that context. And Marta has extensive experience from this area, both within EFSA and outside. Now, our second panel member is Mirjam. She's a cognitive decision scientist and science communicator at the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin, where she also supports the WHO Hub for Pandemic and Epidemic Intelligence. That's a recently created hub. Our third panel member is Vera Novais, who's a science journalist in Portugal and a staff writer for Observador and the president of the Portuguese Science Communication Association. Now, before handing over to Mike, I'd like to encourage you all to participate to the session by putting questions in the live chat box or comments. And I look forward to a session where we can learn and reflect on the current crisis and some broader dimensions. So, Mike, over to you.
Susan, and welcome to everybody again. And I'm not going to say anything more. It's all been said, but would invite. It's a huge personal honour and a great honour for the conference to invite Professor Peter Piot to give the keynote address. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Susan, and hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to this important debate. It's not my first keynote at escaide, but this is the first one on such a these turbulent times, and on what I think is a key issue for the future of the pandemic. This is not the first time I'm confronted with this problem. I'm old enough to have been active in the early days of AIDS, as you heard from Susan, and as head of UNAIDS, I had to deal with a lot of fake news, denial. This would go from President Mbeki denying that there is AIDS and stopping the introduction of antiretroviral therapy to all kinds of problems which had to do more with moral issues, cultural, for example, on condom use and so on. But here we have to deal with a very acute issue at a scale that is, I think, unprecedented. And a fundamental feature of this pandemic has clearly been how to manage uncertainty, as we can see in the title of this session, complexity also, and one of the things that I always say, let's not simplify what's very complex or complicate what's very simple, I think is a good rule in life in general, and with a rapid change in facts. Plus, we're operating in a political environment, and that's a given, that's always true. But in the case of this pandemic, it has been affecting the lives of every single citizen throughout the world, and it is also touching on deeply rooted beliefs, cultural, ideological feelings. So that is something that is a reality. That's a fact of life. I'm not going to try to address all the issues, but rather to launch a debate, as there is no absolute truth of what we have to do. But let's start with a positive note. I always try to see not only the silver lining, but in every crisis there are positive things. And the positive side is that never before has science been so prominent when it came to decision making. And it's interesting to see that this year's Eurobarometer and Edelman's Trust Barometer for Europe put scientists as the #1 group of individuals in whom people have trust. Interestingly also, the second place was held by CEOs of big companies, which in public health we wouldn't assume. In addition, let's not forget that as scientists, we have always advocated to be taken seriously and have even expressed frustration that we're not listening to. Now that we have it, we must live with the consequences and take up our responsibility. And I think that's a good problem to have, better than to have to try to be in the decision-making process or the advisory process. Overall, I should say that many governments, certainly Europe, have tried to follow scientific advice to various degrees. And we should never forget that what we give as advice is just one side of the story. And it's been not always that difficult, at least until recently. I think now it's going to become more complicated now that the epidemic has been going on for much longer, but also that, there are very divisive issues, for example, between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, for whatever reasons. My experience as being a scientific advisor has certainly been that it can be quite easy with President Ursula von der Leyen because of her own scientific and medical background. But we have to realize as scientists that we address only one aspect, and then the political decisions actually can be different. And in all fairness, science has not had the answer to all the questions. So following the science, as some politicians are saying, I think sometimes to, to justify decisions that they made and to escape their own responsibility, is not always like the most straightforward issue. At the Global Health Summit this year or last year, already in Rome, which was hosted by the European Commission and the G20 and Italian presidency, I had the privilege to chair the scientific advisory panel together with Professor Silvio Brusaferro from the Istituto Superiore di Sanità in Rome, and the president of the National Academy of Medicine, the director of the European Center for Disease Control, and Professor Yusin Li from Singapore, the head of the National Disease Control Institute there. And our report emphasized, among various recommendations, the key of scientific advice. And I'd like to quote from them, because I think they give us some really good principles. And it's recommendation number 5 in saying, strengthening and protecting science advice. And this was accepted by the Global Health Summit, in other words, by the heads of state and government who participated in it. And I'm not going to go into any detail, but there are 6 recommendations, probably a bit too many, but anyway. But the first one is about the independence of experts and government advisory bodies, and how to safeguard against the politicization of science. The second one, and I think that's really important also for us scientists, is to clarify the boundaries between science, scientific advice, and politics. And with a transparent definition and demarcation of advisory versus decision-making roles. Thirdly, is that we need to strengthen the mechanisms for rapid advice and evidence-informed decision-making. Some countries have had a tradition, more or less, of a scientist advising various parts of the government. Others, in other cases, that was completely new. Fourth is to make sure that there is a dialogue not only with the authorities, but also with the public. And this is, again, something that, as scientists, we really have to make sure that we invest in that. It doesn't happen spontaneously. And that means a fifth recommendation, that is to communicate transparently with the public when policy decisions deviate from science advice because of the consideration of other factors important to society. And finally, of course, addressing anti-science and vaccine hesitancy. Now, in June 2020 already, there was also a statement of the scientific advice on scientific advice by the group of chief scientific advisors to the European Commission. And it's a long document, but a very down-to-earth, sentences there, and not coincidence. It was chaired by Professor Pearl Dijkstra from Rotterdam, and she said, all easily said, but not so easily delivered, because there are many dilemmas, many tensions, and these issues, that Susan and Mike alluded to. And so let's start with what represents facts, what are facts, and how it can change. Take the whole debate that was at some point quite hot, and that is between, zero COVID versus what I call harm reduction, mitigation, living with COVID. And there was a very interesting talk by Professor Cho Chuan Tan, the Chief Health Advisor of Singapore. Interestingly, he's not called the Chief Medical Officer, but the Chief Health Advisor, because that's what matters. And he was analyzing the approach in many Southern Eastern Asian countries and in the rest of the world. And the reason was, he thought, was that the fact that is experience. In East and Southeast Asia, SARS was the benchmark, and SARS was brought under control, eliminated. We haven't had any SARS since 2003. And so that was, the goal was to get rid of the virus. Whereas in Europe, particularly, we used influenza, pandemic influenza, as the model in a sense, where we know that you can't just eliminate it. And but now with the Delta variant, frankly, things have all come together, and the various strategies, I think, are far more coherent now, I would say, although not completely. I give this example as certainly in the early days, we all did the natural thing, and that is building on our experience and on precedents. And that's also why I think the jury is still out which strategy ultimately is going to be the right one. And it's probably going to be a combination. And it illustrates that also as scientists, as public health officials or academics, experts, we must evolve. We must have that openness and not be too rigid, sticking to the facts, but accepting when the facts change, even if we don't like them. Similarly, but in my view, perhaps more counterproductive has been the position on masks. In some countries, I was then based in the UK, and the position was, oh, we don't have randomized controlled trials, so we can't say anything. We can't recommend masks. And we lost precious times in such countries. And also, as public health experts, we know that the relative risk is one thing, but population attributable risk or benefit is what really matters. This is what Jeffrey Rose taught us, when we go into large-scale population-based interventions. But after the facts comes the question, how to manage debate and scientific challenges in public when the science evolves or when there is no agreement. And as Susan said, within our own institutions, the debates have not been that easy. And of course, basically, scientific debate should not be suppressed, and debate in general. I mean, this is a fundamental element of our democracies. But let's also not lightly use our scientific position as the message that we as public health professionals choose to convey have huge power to influence these decisions, and the faith that people place within experts in the field. So let's think twice before we make statements, before we start tweeting and so on. And we've had too many examples in the world how tweets can destabilize, from President Trump to others, or some scientists. For example, the entirely justified debate on herd immunity was often conducted without consideration for vulnerable, immunosuppressed, disabled, not to mention the great heterogeneity of most of our societies. And I'm sometimes struck also by how scientists step quite naively into public debates, as those are often not scientific debates, but they're debates about something else, about power, money, the role of the state, limits or not of individual debates, liberties, even pure ideology. So let's make it clear when there is a scientific debate and when it is about something else, where just we scientists that don't have much more to say than any other citizen, I would say. So this is quite different from our usual, academic types of debates, and we should recognize that, and that we should also recognize that we as scientists, we have personal views, and it's what we say is not always just purely limited to facts. So scientific debate, yes, definitely. But we always need to be mindful of the context and of the consequences of what we say. Not to suppress, not to auto-censor, self-censor, but to think it through carefully. That's also our responsibility. Responsibility not to feed the doubt machine, as Cecilia Tomori recently wrote in a very interesting op-ed in Nature. So I would say a proliferation of sometimes contradictory messaging from scientists and decision makers create a confusion in the media and public. And sometimes it's enough for one scientist to say something different that gets then, of course, the most attention. I'm not saying that that person is wrong, but it can create many problems. So we have to be clear in our communication. I think transparency is really important, that we have to guard against also not being very clear about the uncertainty, the boundaries of what is known, what is not known, and sometimes what cannot be known at all, such as the long-term future. And to avoid, and so this is something that I'm not sure how to do it, because people on the one hand want certainty, and on the other hand want debate, but this is really key. And from my work on AIDS, I've learned it the hard way, that we are operating in political space. And again, something we should be mindful of, whether we like it or not. It's a fact of life, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it implies several things, in addition to what I just said about scientific debate. And above all, we need to clarify our roles and the delineation between scientists, scientific advice, and political advice and political decision. I always say that if scientists want to take the decisions or be responsible for decisions, then we should run for office. We should go into politics, and probably we need more scientists in politics. But we have to be clear what we give is advice. And secondly, there's a transparency, as I mentioned before. One example is modeling has come to the forefront in terms of policy decision making, and which I personally like a lot. But when we present our studies and the models, we should be very clear about the assumptions, about the probability of various scenarios or various projections, and not just give one, as I've seen too often done by some modelers, some scientists, and giving only either the extreme, the worst case scenario, or the best one. Now, coming to the end, because of the political nature, even ideological nature, scientific advice can carry high risk, even for risk for life. There was an article, again, I think was in Nature, illustrating how scientific advisors, scientists who are active in this field have received even death threats. In my own country, in Belgium, we had Mark van Rans, the virologist, who had to hide and needed police protection because an extreme right-wing, military was wanted to kill him before committing suicide himself. So before concluding, let me say a few words on what is probably one of the greatest challenges for our work today, and that is hesitancy, refusal, mis and disinformation concerning vaccines. I don't like the word anti-vax because it's far more complex than that. To be clear, there's nothing new. This didn't come up with COVID. When you go back even in the 19th century, in the late 1800s, there was a large anti-vax movement in England following smallpox vaccination mandates. So there's nothing new. We've seen it around polio. We've seen it around MMR. But today it is really at a scale that is unprecedented. And it is so important also because the future of this pandemic depends to a large extent, not exclusively, on vaccine coverage. And my wife Heidi Larsson has been studying this for over a decade and saw it coming. But for too long, I would say the public health and vaccination community has been in denial about this and thought it was, I kind of give more information to these people who don't understand. But it's really not about that. It's not always about information. For some, have very valid questions, and information can help. But for others, it is grounded in some other things. And look at the impact of vaccine refusal or hesitancy, what we have today in particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, where it is leading to a major fourth wave, including also, of course, in other countries. What is also different in today's world is not only the extent of the pandemic, but is of course the potential amplification by social media, the ultra rapid spread of particularly fake news and negative news, because it's amplified by the algorithms that social media companies use. And it is not only about vaccines, but also we've seen it with treatment, chloroquine, ivermectin in some parts of the world. And it often goes by language groups. When we look at vaccine hesitancy in Francophone West Africa, there is contamination coming out of, of what's going on in France. So a key question is how to counter misinformation without minimizing valid questions and dismissing healthy skepticism. Healthy skepticism, which is fundamental part of democracy. Once again, many questions are simply, legitimate. And above all, it is to listen, to understand. And we'll find out that it's often about something else, not just about a vaccine or the mask or a treatment, but it can be very, very political or very, cultural. This means to engage with people in meaningful ways to understand the root causes. And just as popular and social media can be, amplifiers of misinformation, we in the public health community must learn how to work with various media. And it's only when we will have achieved a scientific understanding of vaccine hesitancy and its root causes in various societies, because there may have different issues, that we can develop effective inventories and target our interventions. So we need the science here. However, it's only so much we can do if those in power are undermining these efforts, which is the case in some countries, or undermining actively or passively. So let's not forget who, the people to listen to, that people listen to, influence to other people outside our community. There are TikTok influencers with millions of followers. We need to get them on board. So to conclude, the debate will start now, but we need to take a cold and hard look at how we've been doing, learn the lessons, develop the science of science advice, because there will be other crises. And what we're going through now may be small beer when governments, societies, and are finally getting serious about tackling climate change, as very unpopular and costly measures will have to be taken for decades to come, affecting every aspect of our life, not just for a few years as with COVID. And that's why we must work very hard to gain the trust as scientists and to think through what we, how we deal with this. So that means that I would say openness, transparency, and some humility, while becoming as professional as those who are undermining the science. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. As ever, really stimulating and clearly based on a huge body of experience there. I'm sure there are many points that will have struck a chord, and there may well be questions, and I could take this opportunity just to invite the audience. Please use the chat function to post any questions or comments you have. If time allows, we will put these to the speakers. We've had one comment about it being an interesting comment about scientists running for office as being more active as decision makers, and whether there would be thoughts on that from other members of the panel. I will just invite the panel, because we are fairly tight on time and it's a very exciting and full agenda, just to ask the members of the panel if they have any very short observations they'd make on any of the particular points that Peter raised there. Each of the panel members will have a chance to sort of give a longer view as we move through the programme, but let me just run through the panel. Marta, any immediate comments or observations from you from Peter's presentation?
Thank you, Mike, and thank you very much, Peter, for this very stimulating presentation. Now, I just wanted to say that what you said regarding the Eurobarometer and the surveys, about the trust in science also resonate very much regarding food safety. We also launched an Eurobarometer in 2019, and the findings were also that scientists, followed by consumer organizations, were the most trusted sources of information on food safety in the European Union. So just to confirm that. And then also to very much the same regarding what you say on independence of the risk assessors, the functional separation among the ones that give the advice vis-a-vis the one that take the decision, that Europe is champion there, and also the engagement with the different stakeholders, different consumer organizations, industry, NGOs, which is also key, in my view, to have a trust source of risk communication, based on science advice. Just that from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mirjam, any thoughts from your side?
Maybe I can react to the question that was also stated from the audience about scientists moving into politics, and I mean, we have some examples, of course, in Germany. We've been very blessed with a chancellor who is a scientist by training and who is very good at picking trustworthy scientists and, the best scientists to choose those as her advisors. And we have some other scientists in politics too, but I would also maybe hesitate. Of course, as a scientist myself, in a way, I would love to have scientists in politics and have that as a way to give science more weight, but also in politics, oftentimes politicians have many more, agendas and their party and their voters that they have to cater to. So in terms of scientific independence, I don't know, maybe it's not the best to have all of our major scientists in politics and not independent at the scientific organizations or universities. And when it comes to trust, I think in Germany also we've been blessed in the sense that Germany is already a society that is quite, trust in science is quite high. There's a big respect for science and scientists, which is not the case in all countries. But that's a great basis for our work, and also for the Robert Koch Institute, where I spent most of the pandemic. And even though there's been so much criticism in terms of the political decisions, or also the data that the Institute presented, nevertheless, trust in the Robert Koch Institute actually remained very high, and remained also much higher than and more stable than trust in politics. And I think that's obviously extremely valuable. And I think every Robert Koch Institute member is very much aware of this, and of course tries to work their best to keep trust high and to just reach the public. But I will talk a little bit more about that later.
Thank you very much. And Vera, so scientists, top of the league for being trusted. What do we need to do to keep that trust? What do we need to not do to avoid losing it? You're muted, Vera. I think Vera's having difficulties with her microphone. We'll come back to Vera in a minute, but if our technical colleagues could see if they can provide Vera some assistance. Let us, in that case, I would suggest move on to the next part of the programme, and I'll hand back to Susan to introduce the next part of this session. Susan.
Yeah, thank you. So the next part is about our role as scientists and public health epidemiologists, microbiologists, to work with evidence and uncertainty, and especially in the context of weak evidence. And I'd like to invite Marta Hugas to talk about her experience at EFSA, where she's now the chief scientist. Over to you, Marta.
Thank you very, very much, Susan. And welcome. First of all, I'd like to thank Mike and yourself for the invitation to be here. Of course, I come from the food safety side, and from the European Food Safety Authority, which was created in 2002 with adoption of the General Food Law. after a series of food crises, mainly the BSE, but also the dioxins, which undermine the consumer's confidence in the EU food supply. So EFSA is the EU body for risk assessment and risk communication on food and feed safety. That goes from animal and plant health to nutrition and includes food and feed additives, food contact materials, pesticides, genetically modified organisms, etc. So being in the food safety business means that we are on the health business, which has very important connotations compared, to example, to our colleagues in the Medicines Agency, which are in the disease business. And patients are, of course, much more keen in taking risks due to expected benefits than with food. With food, we want zero risk. And each citizen is a consumer and is confronted several times a day with the decision what to eat, what to choose for him or herself, but also for their families and for their children. So this makes food safety a very emotional field, generating a lot of attention. You might have heard about the resonance in the public media of some of our assessments, such as glyphosate, aspartame, caffeine, titanium dioxide, not to mention the genetically modified organisms. So EFSA advises risk managers also on foodborne zoonosis and antimicrobial resistance, among other topics. However, they do not raise the same level of attention and concern to consumers than the ones I previously mentioned. So far, and thanks, we have not experienced anything like COVID-19 in food, and cross-border food emergencies in the EU remain relatively rare and often linked to food fraud rather than safety, as for example, the crisis on horse meat labeled as beef, melamine in feed, or the fipronil crisis. While cross-border incidents and outbreaks are thankfully relatively few, sporadic events over the past 20 years have tested and strengthened a robust crisis preparation and response systems put in place by the European Commission and supported by EFSA and the member states. During the pandemic, citizens, politicians, and the media have trusted, doubted, and challenged scientific advice at different times. This may indicate that the link between science and public health welfare is firmer than we may have believed before the pandemic, but it's not unconditional. Within the EU crisis management framework, EFSA has developed guidelines both for scientific risk assessment and for risk communication during food safety crisis situation, which focuses on cooperation with national competent authorities to ensure there are procedures in place for long-term crisis preparedness and response situation. The communications guidelines trace their origins to the 2011 multi-country Zika toxin E. coli outbreak from fenugreek seeds that you might remember, which claimed the lives of about 200 people. Among the many lessons learned in 2011, contradictory messages from different authorities had played a role in confusing the public and jeopardizing their confidence in efforts to contain and trace the outbreak. So subsequently, EFSA reinvested in what we call our communication expert network, the CEN network, comprising communication specialists from the member state authorities. The CEN meets regularly in peacetime, so to exchange best practices and to maintain close ties with member states' risk communicators, which then prove very useful in crisis time. We also have a crisis communication guidelines which set down guiding principles and provide a 4-step workflow for crisis communication. So it's about information gathering, preparation, communication, monitoring, and review. Scientific and technical information needs gathering, but also insights on the communication landscape. For example, monitoring media coverage in affected areas, countries, as well as intensive social listening to determine critical emerging information sources and influencers. This is a circular process that is repeated continuously throughout the stages of an incident, in the warning phase, risk assessment phase, response, management, resolution, and recovery. And dealing with uncertainty is a critical component in this framework, particularly in the early stages when information may be scarce, but the need to communicate is often urgent. So communicating while facts are still uncertain is one of the hardest challenges in the early stages of an emerging incident. In this situation, it is important to say what you know, acknowledge what you don't know, and indicate what you are doing to acquire that information. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, that's exactly what we did, because there was no information on the role of food in the transmission of the virus, but there were many questions regarding what is the role of food. So despite the lack of information and uncertainty, we published a few lines on our website saying that so far, and also based on previous knowledge from other similar viruses, similar coronavirus outbreak, the SARS, the MERS, there was no evidence that food was a transmission route, but that we were constantly monitoring the evidence should this change. And at the same time, we also gave recommendation. We enhanced the WHO longest-standing message of the 5 hygienic rules when handling of food, which also would apply in case of any contamination of any virus in the food. So assessing and taking account of uncertainties is a normal part of scientific work and of everyday life. For example, meteorologists review satellite images to make predictions about the weather. They are rarely 100% certain what will happen. So when they make a forecast, they usually indicate how likely it is, the forecast. If they say there's a strong chance of rain, you will probably decide to take your umbrella when you go outside. If the chance of rain is slight, you are more likely to decide to leave your umbrella at home. If the forecaster uses percentages like 90% or 10% chance of rain, for many of us, the message becomes even clearer. So the same principles apply to food safety. For example, scientists, risk assessors may be asked to assess the safety of a new food, a pesticide, or a foodborne bacteria. When evidence or knowledge is incomplete, they try to explain how the uncertainty may affect their conclusions. So they carry out an uncertainty assessment to identify and describe the scientific uncertainties and explain the implications for decision making. They may indicate whether or not there is more than one possible outcome and the relative likelihood of each. And exactly with the weather forecast, how certain you are, 100%, 50%, 90%, is important information for decision making. Such information becomes crucial if the decisions have serious consequences for the health of people, animals, and the environment. Identifying and describing scientific uncertainties and explaining their implications on the conclusions in the risk assessment are crucial parts of providing transparent scientific advice. When dealing with uncertainty, decision makers need to know what the different outcomes might be and how likely they are. The way scientists report uncertainties and how public bodies such as EFSA communicate them to decision makers, stakeholders, and the wider public can alter perceptions about the risk and benefits of assessment and impact on related policy decisions. This can also directly or indirectly affect the choices made by individuals. Communicating about uncertainties in a scientific assessment is extremely important, not only to risk managers, but also to the general public. In support of our risk communications, both in peacetime and during an incident, EFSA has developed a harmonized approach for communicating uncertainties to different target audiences, which complements our standardized method for uncertainty analysis in our scientific opinions. Therefore, communication about scientific uncertainty should try to adapt to the language and norms of its audiences. Our approach for communication of uncertainty uses a standardized numerical and verbal formats for explaining the experts' confidence in their conclusions. For example, their certainty that their conclusions are correct. The positive framing, which is also very important, supports the first step of the crisis message development, to state what is known, but also helps to acknowledge that information is incomplete, as experts are almost never 100% certain of an outcome. Our approach also guides communicators in how to layer information to different audiences. For example, defining the uncertainties more precisely and how they can be addressed helps to stress critical next steps in information gathering and processing to move from the assessment to the response and management phases. This structured communications approach is built on evidence from experimental studies in the social and psychological literature and from EFSA's own research on understanding uncertainty and complementing it by expert judgment. When adopting these guidelines, it was the first time at EFSA that experts from social science disciplines, such as sociology and psychology, contributed to the development of an official EFSA publication, working together with our assessors from the natural science and science communicators. Applying these findings to examples of EFSA scientific evaluations, the experts developed a body of practical instructions and advice for communicators to follow, generally in a specific context. The information is layered for different target audiences who were grouped according to criteria such as their scientific literacy and familiarity with food safety issues. Since the guidance was finalized in 2019, there have been no large-scale food safety incidents that would require a major crisis communication effort, but they are being gradually rolled out in a standard peacetime communication. So to conclude, just to repeat one of the messages I said during my speech, that communicating while facts are still uncertain is one of the hardest challenges. In this situation, please remember how important it is to say what you know, to acknowledge what you do not know, and indicate what you are doing to acquire that information. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Yeah, thank you, Marta. That's really a valuable contribution. I think, yeah, food safety is much more similar to our current COVID crisis than I had thought of before this session. So I think there's much to learn also from the long-standing perspective of both food safety and the current COVID crisis. So I'm just looking in the chat to see if there's any specific question to you. I think there's more a general issue from the public, from the participants, about the misinformation that the former US president, this was quite a painful situation where he talked about bleach and chlorine against COVID, and in the presence of Dr. Fauci. So I don't know, anyone of the panel or you, Marta, have you been exposed to such a situation where a politician in public talks nonsense, basically, and how, as a scientific advisor, to respond to that? It's
not really in a similar situation. We haven't been confronted with that, but no. But it's difficult to debunk, this misinformation. But I see Mirjam here that is asking for the floor.
Yeah, Mirjam?
Yes, in Germany, we did not have, of course, a situation like with the former US president, but we still to this day have politicians, sometimes party leaders actually, who say things about the pandemic that are simply not true, who are maybe spreading doubt about the vaccinations, things like this. And just yesterday, together with two colleagues, one from the institute also and one from a university, we sat down for a long time with a journalist, and she was going through things that politicians had said about the pandemic that are just not true, and we tried to debunk them and try to, that will be published, I think, tomorrow in a very widely read online platform. And I think, and what we also discussed yesterday, and what we shouldn't forget is the huge role that the media play in this. And in Germany, there's some political talk shows, for example, that at the beginning of the pandemic maybe invited a lot of people who maybe they couldn't judge yet well that these people actually say many things that are just not true about the pandemic. But then, and they also, between scientists, sometimes created this false balance where they had one pro and one counter scientist, when actually really most scientists were on one side, and one of the two was a huge outlier. So I think, in the end, politicians without the media have very little platform to talk to people. So training journalists about things like false balance, having journalists make sure they fact check, but also maybe training them in ethical ways, in a way, to maybe not publish an interview with a politician when it's just full of things that are not true about the pandemic. I think it's a very important way to address that.
Yeah, there's a responsibility there, I think. Peter, you had...
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, Marta, thank you so much. I think that food and vaccines have a lot in common, because it's about healthy people, and with the risks are often not so clear. So that's something that I'd never thought about. So thank you for thank you for inviting Mike and Susan, and it's a clear example of that. The matrix is a good model, I would say. And I had one question and then one experience to share. One is that there are lots of products, chemicals and so on, that have in animal models or so suggested maybe carcinogenic or so, and but there's no human and real life evidence. And we had recently something around Mosques and titanium oxide in there, and very academic type of publications where the academics then amplify that this is either it is the cure for cancer, or it is the it's going to cause problems. So how do you deal with that? That's one question. And then sharing an experience about being besides a politician who was causing not only saying nonsense but being very counterproductive, was in 2001 at the opening of the International AIDS Conference. President Mbeki from South Africa spoke, and he basically said that AIDS was it's all about poverty, it didn't exist, HIV, and then antiretroviral therapy was killing people, etc. And I was the next speaker. I stood there, and you can imagine how I felt, but I said, on the one hand, you can't offend the head of state of a host country, so to use it as a, what diplomats would say. But on the other hand, I said, there is no way around here. And, and I said exactly, I contradicted him and so on. But it's a difference with the position of Tony Fauci, who was the advisor of President Trump. That is a completely possible situation. And there the question is, do you want to resign and then, and have your moment in the light, in the limelight, or you continue? And that's extremely difficult decision. But it will happen more and more. We've seen it in Brazil happening and so on. So, and in Europe, I agree with Mirjam. This has been particularly with certain talk show hosts and so on who would favor particularly politicians. But that illustrates my point that these are political issues. They have basically not much to do with the science and all that. And educating, or informing journalists is really important. I remember in UNAIDS we had a whole program briefing journalists, and never to tell them what to say. That's also not good, but making sure that they fully understand. And I think here many journalists are extremely well educated. I think sometimes they are better informed than some scientists to make quite of some statements. So the debate goes on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. It's just a question that occurs to me. What would you have done if you were Dr. Fauci in that situation? You talk about two options: resign or diplomatically continue in your role. Can you?
Tony Fauci is a good friend, and I respect him very highly. And he's served about every president. I think I'm maybe a little bit more political, how to say, and but I don't know. You never. How would you be yourself? Is always a very important question before judging someone. But I think the key is to. On the one hand, you can say not to put yourself in that position, but that's not a very courageous way of dealing with it. And I think there are ways of stating the evidence, which Tony Fauci has done. I mean, there is this very moment that, of course, went viral, but he always stuck in his other communication to the facts, which I certainly would have done. But I don't know. I think at my age, I've learned not to judge people because I don't know how I would have behaved myself. In all honesty.
Yeah.
So, good question, though, Susan.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No. It's that's what it's about, and take up your responsibility at these critical moments. But then you have to think. This is my point. Also, I always try to think. Okay, there is my intuitive reaction or what I want to do and the emotional bond, but I have to think. What are the implications and the consequences? Would it be worse to do A or to do B? Not that but sometimes you get 10 seconds. I could give you quite a few examples, but that's beyond this. But sometimes, for example, when a head of state who is not really into this was about AIDS, to it and ask, tell me what you think, and then you have 10 seconds to think, is this a trap or shall I say what I think? And I think I would usually go by the latter, but then how you phrase it. Or one of the things I had to deal with was about sexuality, and homosexuality was one of the big issues around on AIDS, particularly, and so many societies are homophobic, and you can't give one message when you're in let's say a friendly audience, and in public health we tend to talk only among ourselves, or to an audience that's not very friendly and is hostile. I've even spoken in evangelical churches and just name it, and just bring always the same message. But how you do it, that can be a bit different. But I don't think we can compromise on the essence. But you have to think, like I once addressed the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, the school, the Central Party School. Okay, I wanted to talk about human rights and respect and so on. But if you use that word, all receptors close. But there are ways of saying it. You go and there are speeches by Mao Zedong you can use. If you go to, in US Congress, you have another language, but you always need to give the same message. I think that is very important for our own credibility also.
Yeah,
and we owe it to the people
that's,
we work for.
That's important, and you can adapt your tone to not be polarizing. I think there's a French saying, my French is not good, but it's c'est le ton qui fait la musique.
Voilà.
It's so I don't know in English, but it's the way you state it. But I think it's very clear from you that you have to stick to your own knowledge.
But for that you need to very well understand, as you say, who the audience is. Go back to your matrix. And when you go to the Vatican, you don't say the same thing as when you go and you speak at the Pride Parade of the year.
But the essence,
you have the same message.
Great. Sorry. Thank you. So I think, Mike, we will go over to the next part of this session, which is a poll, I believe.
Yes, Susan. So I was mentioned at the beginning, I think by Karen particularly, that there's a link in the app to in the conference, if you're watching online, to Slido, and we're putting up some questions there. There's a QR code there which I think allows you to get to it quickly. So what I would ask is if you could go to that, because you've just got a simple question, and this is related to Peter's comment about being put on the spot, particularly dealing with responding to misinformation. And the question on the slide or in Slido is, as a medical professional, how do you respond to misinformation? And the options are, I prefer not to respond. It's handled by communications department, and we can see them here. I prefer not to respond. It's not part of my job. I would like to respond, but don't know how. I would like to respond, but I'm concerned for my safety. And Peter mentioned some examples of why that might be. I would like to respond, but had a bad experience or experiences. I respond to friends and family, but not in public spaces, or I respond publicly, including social media. So I could just invite you to those that have managed to get onto Slido to express your views there. The moment the preference not to respond publicly is coming up as the dominant one. While that's running, and I think, Vera, we've managed to overcome your sound problems. Just very briefly, while the poll's running, what would you have advised Anthony Fauci in that situation that we just talked about? From your position as a scientific journalist, would you think that Fauci would have been better to resign or to keep in the role and try and change the thinking of the individual that made the provocative statements? Vera.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely. Great.
So I'm so sorry. I missed a part of your talk because I was having difficulties with my microphone. But I don't think someone like Fauci, that is well respected, just should go away from when facing some kind of problem, because that would. You have seen since the beginning that Fauci stood there, and first he was trying to make up what the president was saying. So he was a figure that was standing there just to make up things go right. Of course, scientists fail, and like it has been said here, they have to assume that they have failed or they are not certain about some things, but I don't think they should just go away because of that. I really feel when you say like when people just quit the job because, okay, I made some mistakes, so I quit the job and go away. And I always think like I'm thinking about ministers and someone in the government, for example. It's like they are just putting the responsibility in someone else to solve the problem, and I don't agree with that, of course.
That's helpful. So can we quickly go back to the slide to see where we are with the Slido poll? Is that possible? Okay, so what we have here is, yeah, so 73%, I respond to friends and family, but not in public spaces. The next most common response is I prefer not to respond, is handled by the communications department. 7% right at the bottom, I prefer not to respond, it's not part of my job. 8% have had bad experiences, 11% concerned for safety. So there is clearly a concern or a reluctance. So with that in mind, I'd like to now turn to Mirjam and Vera, who give a brief intervention each related to dealing with misinformation. So Mirjam, could you give us sort of an outline of the guidelines, the good practices that you've developed in the work that you've been doing, particularly in the Robert Koch Institute, but elsewhere, to address misinformation during the COVID pandemic? Mirjam, over to you.
Yes, I think you can hear me now. So since I've been mostly active at the Robert Koch Institute during the pandemic, I will mostly focus on that work. And I have to say that in Germany, before the pandemic, there hadn't really been any strong mechanisms in place to address misinformation. But right at the beginning of the pandemic, several communication departments at the Institute were expanded. There was a whole new unit built that I got to build at the Institute for Science Communication. And then also other players like the Ministry of Health expanded their communication staff, and actually the German Ministry of Health ran a lot of social media campaigns and or telegrams and things like that to address misinformation. Sometimes TV spots were used, although not a lot. And I think I would have liked to see many more TV spots, especially on public television. And the Robert Koch Institute also, there was a lot of collaboration with scientists, with health scientists, with communicators at universities, and also, for example, particularly with the University of Erfurt. And we actually, together with a big consortium, ran a representative survey every week or bi-weekly sometimes, where we assessed citizens' beliefs, knowledge, risk perception, trust in agencies, misinformation, and so on. And we also studied how people search for COVID information, and how often, where do they look the information up, things like this. And of course, the Robert Koch Institute has a strong focus on surveillance, and basically has the role, or got the role during the pandemic, to deliver the trustworthy data and the trustworthy statistics. And we used a lot of press conference actually to talk about the numbers and talk about the things that are important to do now. And we kind of became, or especially our president, Lothar Wieler, he became kind of the trusted voice of reason during the pandemic, and did just a very good job in kind of being this this calm point in a way that people could look to, that just tirelessly delivered the numbers, delivered the scientific results, made some strong statements sometimes, of course, especially during very bad waves, but was never panicky or anything like that. He was just a very kind of solid communicator that many people also really started to appreciate. And then, of course, we also tried to develop new formats for communication, and we had quite a focus, in our role as kind of the trustworthy, deliverers of data and numbers, also communicate risk in numbers, which I think is often either not done enough, so people just make maybe qualitative statements about risks, or it's not done well. Just some numbers are thrown at people, but there's no really care of communicating those in an understandable way. And so we tried out different kind of also graphics and things to try and make clear to audiences, for example, the safety and efficacy of vaccines. Of course, at the Institute, there was a strong focus on vaccine communication. The vaccine communication group, which is actually a separate group, was expanded quite a bit. And we developed our materials for different audiences, for the general public, for doctors. There's a vaccination app for doctors, for example, so they get push messages about the latest information on any vaccination, so not just COVID. And our information was developed according to Germany's good practice for health information, and was also independently actually evaluated by the German Network for Health Literacy. And some of the things they focus on is, of course, are the references there, and what's the goal of the information, is there a date including updates, is there transparency about funding sources, and then the independence, things like this. And we still, so at the Robert Koch Institute, we still don't really do social listening or things like that, although more and more staff of the Institute also do the infodemic management training by WHO. And of course, now also with kind of me being in this double role at the Institute, but also at the WHO hub in Berlin, there's a lot of, always there's been a strong relationship and a lot of communication between the two, but that's just getting strengthened now. And really, kind of the main, the almost stubborn strategy has been to create this continuous stream of trustworthy information on many channels, reaching policymakers, journalists, and the general public. And I've mentioned earlier that trust in the institution actually stayed quite high during the pandemic, even though before the pandemic, the Institute actually did not address the public, but it started to do so during the pandemic just because the public looked to the Institute so much. And I think this kind of success in fighting misinformation and also just delivering trustworthy information was this kind of, steadfast deliverance of statements and solid numbers, explaining the numbers to the public continuously and transparently, and also the Institute's excellent reputation that it had already, but also then, of course, this early expansion of communications efforts and communication teams with this focus on risk, vaccination and crisis communication. And then, of course, strong collaborations with national and international researchers to, also to make sure that we have similar messages and communicate kind of as this whole, scientific frontier almost. So that's what we've been doing, and I think for the future it will just be very key to continue to build on this. Basically, suddenly the Institute is known to a broad range of people, is known to the public, and so for future health crises, we really need to make sure to keep this very good relationship to the public and kind of not let go of this just because the pandemic will be over at some point, but kind of keep working on this trust is something that is very easy to lose and hard to build, and we have it now, so we really need to continue the work and just be in contact with our stakeholders.
Okay, thank you very much, Mirjam. So be visible. Establish a dialogue, and I have my personal observation is that through this pandemic, actually, more often than not, the media, the journalists are grateful for scientific input, and actually, it's not. I've not really seen much confrontational interviewing, and I think that hopefully we can build on that. So moving across now to Vera, we've got a few. We're running out of time, but Vera has one of the things that Vera has done over many years as a scientific journalist is looked at debunking misinformation about science and health. And Vera, for this audience of scientists, some experience, but many just starting out on their career, what would your advice? What approach can you give about how we can best actually tackle this growing problem of misinformation? It's a small question to ask, but it's a big issue.
I think when we can change completely the way the poll showed the answers, we will be in the right path. People saying that having experts saying they only talk to their family or they go only through their communication office, and they don't want to talk publicly or don't want to talk to journalists, don't want to tackle also this misinformation, or at least give some information to the audience. I think it's the tip of the problem, because if a journalist wants to fact check, to give the right information, if a journalist doesn't have sources to give that information, it has a problem. We can try to read papers, as many as you want, but we don't have enough time, we don't have enough expertise, and some papers are not so good. And we have been a lot of preprints, some of them very good, some not so good, and we needed experts to help us drive through this information. And if experts are not available, it poses a problem to us journalists, and in the end we are the closer communicators to the audience, to the general audience. And if we are missing the right information, the best information, we will not give the best information to our audience. And then journalists are being criticized for not writing the correct stuff. Besides that, we have seen, at least in Portugal, I've seen during the pandemic that in the beginning, scientists and other experts were too worried to understand what was happening. And that is correct. But in the meantime, they were not available to go to a TV to make some comment. So when real experts on a topic, epidemiologists or virologists or so on, are not available to go and explain to the audience what is happening, someone will come. Other people, some were physicians for a long time, well-known figures, and well-renowned, but they were not experts on their topic. They were just discussing vague information that they had on the topic. And then we had what I call the newborn experts, bunch of people, no one knows where they came from, but they came full of certainty and trying to show some models and so on, and they were always on the news. So when real experts, the experts that know about that topic, don't fill the gap, someone will. And journalists and newsrooms need people to explain stuff, because it won't come only from us. So it is, and it was really hard for us to distinguish if it was a good, a proper expert for that topic. No one knew enough about it, and also to check if it is a proper paper to report on that topic, and we need experts for that. And besides, this is one of big problems. I just raised 3 problems that we face in journalism nowadays, and this is one of them. And the second problem is that journalists, and I'm working for the press, not for the TV, and we have to write a lot, and we have to write fast. So, and news media are always competing with each other to be the first to give some news. So we have to have like a group of experts we know we can rely on. We can call them and ask, even if it's not to quote them, at least ask, is this for real? Am I thinking the right way about this topic? Is this news written in the best way for the audience to understand it? For example, if experts are not available, or they are only available in 1 week and I have to write it for today, so I will have a problem. I will have to search for other experts and maybe not finding the best one. So and tackling this problem is always too hard, and it's getting harder and harder in newsrooms, because we have less and less journalists in general, and we have less and less science journalists. And what we have seen during this pandemic was that, and I find this the third problem, the shrinking newsrooms. And what we have seen during this pandemic it was that every journalist had to become some kind of science journalist or health journalist, reporting on what was happening. And at least I know it will be very hard to have a science desk in every news media, but at least every journalist should be able to have some training on science to be able to report on science. But what I find the most important, and is something that we have to build before the pandemic, before the time of crisis, we have to build relations of trust between journalists and experts. So when the time of crisis comes, we are able to work together, and to work together respecting different times, because science and journalism have really different times. But if we have a good, trustful relations, we will be able to work together, and that is the best way to debunk misinformation and to get the right information to the audience.
Great, thank you. And that's a really nice wrap to this discussion in terms of doing the misinformation. It's about be visible, be available. So we've had a number of questions and comments from the audience. I think we're running out of time, but we can all reflect after this on how well we think risk communications worked through the pandemic. But I'd just like to turn to Susan now, my co-moderator of the session. And Susan, any key take-home messages that you think you'd like to share with the audience from this?
Yeah, thank you. So one key point is that we can learn, I think, a lot from food safety. And it was useful to know that there's guidelines and harmonized approaches that were developed there already. So we should look at that, I think. I think the other thing is that what Peter said, we have to stay to the essence of what we know, but we can adapt the tone. So we have to know the audience. And I was a bit shocked, to be honest, to see the response of the poll that many people are reluctant to deal with misinformation. And then what we get is, as Vera said, the newborn experts who happily fill in the niche. And there's so many people with opinions. So it's easy to say we have a responsibility to go out there, but it is increasingly complex with all these preprints and even papers like journals like Science publishing rubbish studies. The recent study on Janssen was shocking, and it's in Science, so it's not getting easier at all. And then also with the personal threats, maybe. So my personal learning is that we should connect and we have to discuss amongst each other and support each other, and and get out there to establish the dialogue. So that's my take-home message.
Thank you, and I think there were so many messages that I took from it. The good news, as Peter said at the beginning, is scientists have a position of trust, according to the Eurobarometer, and we need to make use of that. And I think also, as many of the speakers said, it's really important that as scientists, as experts, we are visible, we are accessible, that we use opportunities to communicate with the public through the media as necessary. One of the issues, and in that we have to be open and honest about not only what we do know, but what we don't know. And I think one of the really important points that that Marta made actually was, we say what we know, what we don't know, but I think and something that gets forgotten, we also need to say what we are doing about the things that we don't know. I mean, as scientists, we need to do that anyway, but I think we also should communicate that. And just that dialogue with the public, we need to find tools, whether it's infographics, whether it's a narrative approach, message about risk across better. And perhaps one final point, which is one that Peter made, is think twice before tweeting. I think that's good advice. If you are a tweeter, think twice before you hit that button. And just remember to take look at the big picture. Population attributable risk. Thank you, Peter, for saying that. It's so important that we keep coming back to population attributable risk when we're thinking about what we communicate. So I'd like to say thank you so much to our audience. Really excellent and thought-provoking presentations. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for interaction with the audience. We will take note of that for next year. But with that, I'm going to say one final thank you, and to Susan as well for co-organising this session. And I will pass back to Karen now in the studio, as they say. Karen.
Thank you very much, Mike, and a brilliant panel discussion. I mean, keynote speaker, chairs, moderators, you did a fantastic job. As a journalist, I found it really interesting to hear, more again about the challenges we face, trying to communicate complex issues, maybe scientific topics in a way that people will understand. So it was really good. And the advice about thinking before tweeting applies, I think, across the board. So thank you again. That was a super panel discussion. Now, coming up next, we have the first first of the poster tours, and the posters are grouped by disease area or health function, and they allow presenters to give an overview of their work and take questions from the audience. Our first two poster tours are on COVID-19, field epidemiology and implementation science. You can visit the virtual poster exhibition on Swapcard and explore the abstracts and engage with the presenters. And the poster tours will be followed by a lunch break for an hour from 1200 to 1300 Central European time. And during the lunch break, we will have the side session, Piot in Focus, the past and the future of a regional field epidemiology programme in the EU neighbourhood. So enjoy the rich content ahead, and I will see you after lunch.